A few months back, really closer to a year ago, a friend of mine suggested that we do something interesting with our night for once. He told me about how he had been to one of the city's cemeteries after dark a few times, and that it terrified him, but in that sort of way that makes it worthwhile. I was a little against it at first, because the cops like to check on the area often, and there was no way we were going to be walking into the graveyard sober. Of course, however, my mind changed when we got to talking. "You know about the witch?" He started cracking a grin. "I think so." I had heard very little. "Remind me, just in case." "So there's supposed to be this witch or ghost or some crap, and I know right where the grave is." Jesus, alright. I don't know exactly what I believe, but I know that the place is messed up. He paused, thinking hard. I said, "I honestly don't believe in anything, but a dark graveyard is scary anyway. Definitely need to check it out sometime if we don't get to it tonight." He popped up with, "Oh man, I just remembered there are these dead kids." "What?" "There's a bunch of graves together for this one family, and a bunch of them are these kids. That spot is extra creepy. They're all old as hell, from like the 1800s or something." "Well, I guess we gotta go see all of it." We pulled into the lot when the sun was setting and decided to smoke a little bit in the car since we had time anyway. As we smoked, the whole place emptied out, and we were the only ones in sight. By this point, we were at a comfortable level of dissociative perfection, so we brought just a little bit of it with us. And, of course, my pack of cigarettes, which is no longer a habit of mine, but at the time was a means for managing stress. So, off we went, with a bit of sun still shining and one single truck riding through the cemetery. We figured it would be good to wait for the truck to leave, assuming it was a worker watching for any unwanted guests. Although they had left the gates wide open, we were a little unsure of the legality of being around after dark, and a little bit uneasy about some psycho employee ratting on us and getting us caught with what we had. After about 10 minutes and 3 or 4 rounds of the truck passing by, we figured it would be smart to just go ahead and hide wherever we were if he passed by us again. We made our way down the main hill that leads into the center of the cemetery, and we noticed a chill that seemed to pass as we entered the real part. I passed it off as a weird current made by the creeks and the cooler air in that area, but a part of the primal fear that remained in the back of my mind made me question my devotion to reality. There were a few times where we had to hide behind a tree as the truck made its way back around, and then we would make a few more minutes of progress. As we began to become too close to sober, we imbibed a bit more. Another 30 minutes or so passed, and we had decimated almost our entire on-hand supply. We also had no clue where we were. As we wandered along the dark, winding roads, we started to get concerned about our phone batteries. His phone was worse off than mine, being near dead already, although mine was hardly doing better. After deciding to keep them in our pockets for the time being, the dark and discomforting silence started to make both of us paranoid. It was, of course, a bit heightened by our habits. We also noticed something else that was upsetting. We had started to go around in circles. As we realized this, I had the first real wave of fear for that night come rushing over me. I could swear that someone was inside one of the mausoleums with their face just barely out of view and moving around in the shadows. Dude, do you see that?" On instinct, I grabbed for my inhaler. "What? What the hell are you talking about?" my friend said. "In that, right there." I looked toward the window rather than pointing. "I swear to Christ, I just saw someone in there. I saw the shadow of a face." My friend brushed me off. "You're just freaked out because you smoked too much. It's nothing. Come on, we need to get to the witch, and then we can get the hell out of here." "You still want to go see that?" "Well, yeah. If you don't want to, that's cool, but I'm gonna. I mean, alright, I'm cool with doing that, but I'm just getting a little out of it." About 3 cigarettes and another hour later, we heard something unnerving. At first, we assumed that it was a bunch of drunk teenagers, based on the volume and range of noises being made. Walking further, we found a sign for construction, and being high, we thought it made perfect sense that a group of construction workers must be around. You know, for some good nighttime, silent construction work. Then the voices began to get a bit too quiet for our comfort. We booked it, barreling in no real direction, and somehow ending up at the place. "Here it is," my buddy exclaimed. "This is it?" I looked to a massive circle of tall, dry grass. "Is it in the middle of this?" "No, man," he replied. "It's way in the back." "Come on, I'll show you." I put another cigarette to my mouth with a slight tremble in my hand and followed him through the pitch black and to a large stone structure in a patch of dirt. It was the family he had mentioned, and it made my stomach turn. The cold, rushing wave of fear came back, but it was too late to change my mind. We walked onto the large stone slab and then around it. As we walked around it, he pulled his phone back out to read the headstones. I was nervous with his light being on at this point, after being near those people that we had seen. After a minute, he turned to me. "You want to see the really messed up part?" "Messed up how?" I asked. "The forgotten children. Their graves are back there down a skinny path." He motioned toward the trees. "You down?" "Well," I said, "I've got my smokes. Let's go." We looked at the graves, and my stomach turned, but I was unsure of why. I disliked the idea of dead kids, but my demeanor would never call for me to feel as sick as I did at that moment. Then my friend flipped his phone light back on to read off the names and dates. I started to really become anxious at that point, even voicing it. I scanned the woods, unable to see anything. My friend told me to just calm down, that the people we had seen had probably left by now. Then we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the woods. At most, it was 50 feet away. It was an unusual scream, aggressive almost. It didn't sound as if someone were hurt, but more that they were threatening us. I was sure at the time that it was a woman, but the hopeful side of me likes to imagine that we just heard some animal. As we paced back down the path toward the stones at the base, I pulled a few cigarettes from my pocket and began to light them like crazy. This was pushed further by my friend stopping to read more stones, as we saw no one following us. Within 10 minutes he had had his fill, and we continued back into the main area. After even more walking, we passed a group of cars parked in a grass patch. We assumed they must have belonged to the group of people from earlier, but we began to wonder why more than 1 or 2 people would be there for so long. Then we got lost for real. Deep in the back of the property, we found the witch's spot, but nothing of interest, so we decided to head back. By now his phone had died, so we used mine to get a map up. We had 30 minutes of walking to get through to get to the car. Halfway back, we started hearing voices again, loud and brash. However, as we got closer, they got less energetic. I peered ahead and froze, grabbing my friend and shushing him. I could see 3 large shadows right down the path from us. I also forgot my phone screen was on, and heard something I'll never forget. "Wait," a deep voice murmured. "Do y'all see that?" "See what?" A second man joined in. "That, right there." The silhouette of his arm pointed directly to us. "That light." I slapped my phone screen against my torso, panicking in an attempt to turn it off. Both of us held our breath, staying still as statues while that group kept discussing. "Go check it out then," chimed a woman's voice. "Or are you too scared?" "Why don't you stay here and check it out while we leave?" "Oh, screw off," she teased, in a way that helped me think they were decent people. We started to shimmy toward the patch of graves to our side, hoping they would forget about us and leave like they had said. But then we saw what kind of people they really were. The first man hushed both of the others, and nearly gave me a heart attack. "Let's get 'em." Both men darted toward us, but we were out of sight by then, low to the ground by the hill that we had run across, hiding. We heard them making their way around the area, and we somehow circled behind them, making it out. Then we heard cars starting. For about 20 minutes, these psychos circled through the paths looking for us, and it cost us another half hour overall. Exhausted, we made our way to the entrance, with an empty cigarette box, an empty bag, and a little bit of paranoia. We got back to his place and spent at least another hour talking about how insane that all of it had been, and then we had a thought. A ridiculous, but unnerving thought. What if we saw nothing at the witch's spot because she had been in the woods by the family? And then an even worse thought popped up. What if the scream wasn't aggressive like I thought, and those people had done something to someone right near us? Whatever really happened, I know one thing. I'm never going back there without a full group of friends and fully charged phones. I was 13 years old, 2003. My friend and I were bored and decided to have some weird fun. Now, I've always had interest in supernatural and occult-like things. I've always been very empathic and in tune to things in a way that's hard to explain. Anyways, I didn't have a real Ouija, so we used paper and drew one, and then used a quarter for the planchette. We asked if anyone was there and if they wanted to talk. Of course, there was nothing for a few minutes. Suddenly, the feathers of my dream catcher in my room started to sway. No open window or AC on. We asked again if anyone was there, and then it felt like there was a pull. We allowed ourselves to let go and just see what happened. It went to the yes. We asked what its name was, and we felt pulled towards D and C. Just those letters, D, C. Odd. A minute or so later, my grandma called for us that she was ready to go, as we were about to go to the mall. We stood up and walked out of my room. My friend looked at my face and gasped, and told me to look in the mirror. I had about a 2-inch scratch on my face that was not there before. We were a little freaked out, but mostly confused. We went shopping and my grandma asked what had happened, and I told her I really didn't know. The next morning, the scratch was gone. After that night, however, things got pretty bad. My room for some reason started to feel colder than the rest of the house. Even my grandma commented a few weeks later that my room was, quote-unquote, cold as death. My dog stopped coming into my room as well. He would stand at the doorway and I would call for him and he would just look at me and leave. He might come in rarely for a minute or so, but he would never stay. I started to get feelings like I wasn't alone. The air felt thicker, the dark seemed darker. When I was home alone, I would hear things, footsteps and creaking. One night, it all came to a head. My grandparents went out to dinner and I stayed home. I was downstairs playing on the desktop and instant messaging my friend. The bathroom door next to me had been shut tight, but made a clicking sound. The knob had turned and the door had opened slowly. I got up and slammed it shut. I went back to playing my game and instant messaging when I heard a loud crash. I got up and saw my grandparents' crucifix that had been hanging on the wall, on the floor. I put it back and turned on as many lights as I could, and the TV, and just took my mind off it all. Around this time, my grandma, who is very Catholic, started getting into more New Age things like crystals and psychics. She went to one and the psychic told my grandma that she had a granddaughter who saw orbs, but that these orbs I had been seeing were angels protecting me. It is true that I had been seeing a lot of flashing lights that I called orbs in those months. Fast forward a year or so, and some things happened to me that I won't go into here. Depression and hospitalizations and boarding schools. When I got home from boarding school, my grandma told me that she had spent a night in my room. She had laid down to go to sleep, and suddenly heard a cranking noise. She said she remembers thinking to herself, "Please don't start playing music." And then my music box started playing. She said she bought a lot of different incense and played a special prayer on repeat for days and basically prayer bombed the whole house. When I returned home, my room felt clean, like whatever had been there was gone. Safe. I stopped seeing the orbs as much. I never played with a Ouija board again, but I do love the designs. I have a Ouija board mug and a Ouija board mat on my dresser. I like the symbol and am not afraid of them, but I will never use one again. I have been tempted through the years to try again, hoping that maybe being better prepared I can have a safer outcome, but I just don't know if I want to take that chance of opening a door to any stranger knocking. This is an encounter I experienced in the summer of 2009. I was born and raised in the plains of Texas, specifically in an area where black-eyed kids sightings are prevalent. I had heard the stories, tales, legends, whatever you want to call them, since I was a young man, but never truly believed them. The black-eyed kids were mainly something I entertained as a joke, or something to get a rise out of people. This changed in the summer of 2009. It was a warm night in June. I was up late, around 2 a.m., as I typically like to stay up late, especially in the summer since it would be fairly warm even after the sun went down. I had just run up to the store to grab a big fountain drink and was returning into my house through the back door when I was approached by two kids, a boy and a girl. I was very startled once I realized that they were there, since I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone in my backyard so late at night. The little boy asked, "Could we come in? We need to use the phone, we're lost." This is when I noticed the blackness of their eyes. Both of them, so dark, they were like pits. This is also when my heart sank. I couldn't believe I was actually seeing them, that they were there, right in front of me. As I mentioned before, I had heard the legends of the black-eyed children most of my life, so there was no way I was going to let them in my house. I darted inside and locked the back door as quickly as I could. Once I was in, I ran upstairs and flipped on the lights to try and see if they were still outside. Thankfully, by then, they were gone. I had so much adrenaline pumping by that point, though, that I grabbed a weapon and began searching the house and making sure all doors and windows were locked. It took me hours to get to sleep that night, and it's an encounter that will stay with me for the rest of my life. These entities took the form of something most people view as innocent, weak, mild, and try to trick unsuspecting people and do God knows what with or to them. I'm just glad my reflexes kicked in and I was able to live to tell the tale. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went camping in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people that I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted one another. We had been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized that we had bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather, so we had changed course and gotten off the trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground. It was the kind of place with hookups for RVs, picnic tables, it had fire pits and grills, and a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or another house. There may have been a few other small groups, but if there were, we never interacted with or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet, and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark, and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group, I had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes, followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise to my left, and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet away off the trail. There was a strange light around him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad, and he said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower. All the blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were really freaked and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot, but this was long before any of us had ever experimented with any mind-altering substance. Regardless, I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever, and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth, and then walked back together in complete silence. When we got to the spot that I had seen, whoever he was gone without a trace. The water pump was still there, though. No one had noticed it before, because it was a ways off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed really scared. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all the years since then, I've never been able to figure out what occurred. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Unlikely. Did I hallucinate it? Also unlikely. So who's to say? So a couple of years ago, I want to say like 2 or 3, me and my friend were bored. This was around the time that the Ouija board trend was going around on YouTube, and that kind of stuff has always, and still does, fascinate me. So we both decided to make a Ouija board out of a rectangle of cardboard that we cut off of a box. I believe we also made a ghetto-looking planchette out of cardboard too, with a hole cut out of the middle and everything. So anyways, we brought the thing into the basement of my house. Already a huge mistake, as I learned after. And we started messing around and using it. I don't even remember what we asked it or anything that really happened in detail, but I do remember being in such shock because I felt a strong connection, almost like a magnetic pull, pulling it down and moving it from underneath. Another thing that we both admitted to feeling after we played with it for a couple of minutes was a cold chill, only on our arms, that we were playing with. It wasn't really a breeze, but it just felt, well, bone-chilling. The point of this story comes into play now. That night I was in my bedroom, and I got up to go to the washroom, which is straight across the hall from my room, to brush my teeth and get ready for bed. I left my phone on my bed before leaving. So after I was done getting ready and all, I opened the bathroom door and immediately noticed that my room's lights were turned off. This threw up a red flag in my mind right away, and while I was scared, I just thought it was nothing and flipped the lights in my room back on. I went to grab my phone to distract me from the adrenaline and try to calm me down before bed, and I didn't see it on my bed. Or anywhere, for that matter. I got creeped out and immediately flipped the lights off and jumped into bed and hid under the covers. I tried to fall asleep, even though the thought that the Ouija board we had used earlier that day was in the closet about 5 feet away from me would not leave me alone. I swear I heard a faint knock from inside my closet multiple times that night, but maybe it was just my mind messing with me. The next morning, I wasn't as scared or freaked out as I was the night before, and I got up to take a shower. Once I got out of the shower and stepped out of the bathroom, my phone was right there, on the floor, right in front of me. To this day, it still troubles me, and I have no idea what happened that night. I haven't touched the cardboard Ouija again, but I did purchase a legit Ouija board like 3 months later, and have not really had any outstanding experiences with it, like I had with the cardboard one. This incident happened to me when I was 14, and I've told the story and gone over it in my mind so many times exactly as it happened that it feels as if it were just yesterday. My uncle, 2 younger cousins, aunt, and I had gone up to the Rocky Mountains to have some fresh air and watch the stars. We went up a lot back then, when you were still allowed to at night. Now that park closes at 10, sadly, and our adventures such as this one ended about 3 months after this incident. Those 2 things are somehow inextricably linked in my mind. I can't help but wonder. We all 5 piled out of my uncle's AMC hatchback, a tight fit, and stood around the car on the side of the dark road talking about life and joking about Mothman. Betty, my aunt, was the first to hear a noise in the woods across the road to our left, but we dismissed it as an animal, and the adults and I, being older and in on the joke, tried to scare the kids. But a loud crash came from the woods, when no one had thrown anything, nobody had gone over there, and I'd had my eyes on the whole group the entire time, which meant that none of us were laughing now. My uncle chuckled nervously. Let's get in the car. We got in silently. Something had changed. The wood was quiet except for the sound of the car itself toiling down the mountain, as something followed our car, moving the trees about 10 yards behind us on the driver's side where the mountains slanted down. Nothing but trees over here, I thought. What the hell could that thing be? Feeling the tension in the car, I took matters into my own hands and leaned out the back driver's side window intrepidly. It was still behind us, crashing through the trees and moving through the treetops, right after our car. My mind grew curious. Go faster, I urged my cousin Brian. He sped down the winding road, but the thing in the forest followed. I looked at the speedometer. 35. We could do this. Go faster, I said. It was keeping pace, but always just behind the car. I was livid that I could not catch a glimpse of whatever was big enough to make such a racket and bend the trees to its whim. I finally yelled at him to go faster, but again the thing kept up. Our tiny car was racing down the winding mountain road, sheer rock on one side of us, certain death on the other, our headlights the only things lighting the way down as we sped out the gate of the park, turned, and peeled down the paved road toward town. The kids were in tears. Brian nearly was too. Betty was silent, something which, if you knew her, you'd know the gravity of the situation when she actually chooses to shut up. Brian was yelling back at me and asking me what that thing was as I crawled back into my seat and buckled up. No, I said dejectedly. I couldn't see a thing. Months later, I tried to talk to my family about the occurrence, and found that none of them even remembered it except Betty. They had blocked it out of their memories, I guess from sheer shock, the poor souls. Even to this day, my uncle and younger cousins don't even want to talk about it. Looking back now and having watched a lot of Bigfoot investigations since, it's a likely possibility that what I didn't see was a Sasquatch. However, there were things even weirder than that in this local area. This story takes place during the late summer in the 1960s in Iowa in a very small farming community. My friend's great-grandpa, Bob, owned a farm out there. He had acres of corn, wheat, potatoes, etc., but corn was his main crop, so he had a huge cornfield. It was around 2 a.m., and his grandfather couldn't sleep, so he went outside to get some fresh air. While outside, he noticed something that looked like a child walking around in the cornfield. So Bob ran back inside and grabbed his double-barrel shotgun and woke the farmhand for backup. They combed through the cornfield in an attempt to find whatever was running around out there. After a while, they still couldn't find anything, so Bob told the farmhand to go back inside the house while he stayed on the porch to watch his cornfield. Then, as he looks at the gravel road between his yard and the fence line that led to the cornfield, standing on the road was a little girl around 6 years old or so, and she was wearing a white dress that made her look like she had just gotten out of church. Bob thought that his mind must have been playing tricks on him, so he tried to lay down on the couch to rest, but also stay somewhat alert. However, not even a minute after he laid down, he heard a knock on the screen door. He walked up to the door and slightly cracked the main door open. He saw the little girl and asked, "May I help you?" The little girl said, "Mister, I'm lost, and I don't know where my parents are. Can I come in the house and use your telephone?" Bob felt uneasy, and told her that he could get her a glass of water and that he can call her parents for her if she gave him the number, but he didn't feel comfortable allowing her in his home. He felt something off about the little girl. However, the little girl insisted to be the one to call and talk to them. And Bob said, "Young lady, it's 2 a.m, and I don't feel right letting a stranger into the house, little girl or not." The little girl started to get agitated and said, "I'm not leaving until you let me in to use your phone." Startled, Bob told the little girl that he was going to call the police to come pick her up so that they could keep her safe and find her parents. He closed the door to go and call the police, and he heard someone punch the door like a grown man. He walked back and cracked the door open again, but when he looked, he realized that it was still the little girl, and that she was the one who had punched the door. But when he looked at her this time, she didn't have any eyes. Instead, she had pitch black orbs instead of eyes, and she said in a deep voice, "Let me in." Bob grabbed his shotgun and pointed it at the little girl and told her no and to go away. After this, the little girl looked right into the barrel and then back up at Bob, smiled smugly at him, and giggled before she ran back into the cornfield and disappeared. This took place a few years ago. I was with my best friend and we decided to go camping at a campsite in Flagstaff named Lockett Meadow. We had taken our dogs. After a day of hiking and exploration, we played around a fire and eventually went to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to find this deep figure outside of our tent, burying itself into our tent. It had a weird way of hovering back and forth over my body, and my dog, who was curled up awake and not moving or making a sound, was at the bottom of my feet. I look over and see my best friend passed out, and his dog, which I'm unsure if it was awake, but clearly I was the only one between my friend and I that's experiencing this terrifying encounter. I eventually covered my head and thought about anything else that might make me fall asleep. The next day I asked my friend if he had somehow been awake through all of that. I explained what had happened. He replied no, and thought that I was just making it up. I told him maybe it was a bear, so we looked around our campsite, but couldn't find anything. No trails, no prints, nothing. We also had food out on a table near our tents, and a trash bag hung up on a broken branch, so even if it was a bear, I'm really surprised that it didn't get into any of our stuff. Either way, I remember how scared shitless I was, seeing this dark object observing our tent. Could it somehow have been the wind? A deer? Who knows? But this is just one encounter out of the whole trip. The next night we decide to camp at Beaver Creek. Mind you, we're in Arizona. Before we wanted to settle in, we explored Sedona. We drove to Oak Creek and parked our car near a trail down by the water. We took our dogs and hiked to the creek. After we finished jumping in and swimming, we dried off and were about to head out. Next thing you know, in our peripheral vision, we see a giant rock being thrown near us. It makes a huge splash in the water. We look up and don't see anything above, so we ran over stones and rocks to get a clear view of the top, and still see no one. We yell out taunts and curse words, but still heard no one running off or any kind of sound in response. When we got to our next campsite at Beaver Creek and set up, my friend told me that throughout the trip since we started in Flagstaff, he had rocks being thrown at him, right up until that giant one at Oak Creek. We looked at each other and thought that maybe someone was following behind us, messing with us. Then we sort of laughed it off and said no, that was impossible, that we were just trying to connect the dots to have it be a cool look-back adventure. Well, I'm glad that it didn't turn into a part 3, because nothing happened that night, or the next day, where we packed up and headed home with nothing more than a memory that we wanted to rationalize. This story took place during my childhood when I was about 12 years old. A few days ago I thought about it, and still don't know exactly what it was, and what I should think. It's not the most spectacular story, but anyway. I grew up in an apartment that was pretty outside the city and close to a forest. We had a lot of greenery around, and we were always playing and sometimes also camping outside with friends during the summer. So one night, me and 2 friends decided to build my tent and sleep outside. We were always then staying up really long and telling ghost stories. While we did this, we suddenly heard noises from outside the tent. We were all holding our breath. Then we could hear steps. They came closer and closer, and then the steps even went around our tent before stopping. We got really scared and said, "Whoever you are, go away or we will call the police." It seemed to work because the steps continued and headed away from our tent. After a minute or so, we then tried to be brave and go outside the tent to see who it might have been. Then, when we looked out, we saw a woman, dressed in a long, white gown, walking away in the dark. I still don't know who or what she was, but it continues to give me chills. During the summer of last year, I was visiting my family at my grandma's house. I met up with my cousins and we decided to take the day to go out, eat, and catch up. After countless conversations regarding how my grandmother was still extremely religious, Muslim, we reflected on how we turned out not to be so religious and laughed. Until we had the brilliant idea of playing with the Ouija board in my grandma's living room, where, mind you, she had a chandelier that played 2 small verses from the Quran every time it was turned on. When we went back to the house, it was already nighttime, but we decided to wait a little longer before we began. Meanwhile, out of curiosity, we asked our grandma about the Quran lights. She said that her uncle had installed them about 6 years ago and that they had stopped working, reciting the verses, not actually lighting up the place. About a month after he bought them, and she laughed it off. Later, when we found that the living room was vacant, it was our perfect chance. We turned off all the lights and settled around the table where we placed the Ouija board and everything. We began the process, following the instructions carefully. After about 15 minutes of nothing, we decided that the Ouija board didn't work, and that we didn't have the true paranormal experience that we wanted. It was our first time playing, or trying to. We closed it up and I got up to go turn the lights back on, and the second I did so, the chandelier started reciting holy verses of the Quran. I froze in place and stared at my cousins, who looked just as shocked as me. I turned the lights off immediately and got out of the room while one of my cousins rushed to take the Ouija board out of the room as well. One of my cousins said that this is a warning from God, that a spirit had entered and that the Quran was pushing it away. I didn't believe him, but we turned the lights on again, and that time, the verses didn't play. I thought it might have been a coincidence, a creepy one, but a coincidence nevertheless. My cousin grabbed the Ouija board and stepped back in with it, and she turned on the lights, and again the chandelier recited the verses. This time she looked at me and said that there was no way that it could be a coincidence. We all agreed that we wouldn't mess around with it again, and we threw out the Ouija board the next morning. The chandelier never recited the Quran again, and we never told our grandma about it. I was around 12 when I had gotten a babysitting job with a family across town. The family was new to the area and just recently bought the house next to my best friend's place. My first day over was to get familiar with the kids and the house. The parents stayed and evaluated me and of course answered any questions that I had. I spent my time playing and keeping the children occupied. It was a boy named Devin, age 4, and a girl named Cameron, age 7, so I had my work cut out for me. Cameron wanted me to go to her room so she could show me her toys. I followed her up the 2 flights of stairs, but as we came to the top of the stairs, I felt strangely lightheaded, and the hair on my arms rose up. I had an intense feeling of being watched, like there was someone else up there with us. I tried to ignore the sensation and continue with my duties of finding Cameron's favorite doll so that we could go back downstairs. At the end of the day, it was decided that I was a good match, and I was to come back on Saturday morning. As I headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I got from that upstairs. I told myself, it's nothing, and I brushed it off to just being in a new place and unfamiliar surroundings. That Saturday morning, I showed up to a busy home as the parents tried to get out the door and show me the last-minute things that I needed for the day ahead. The kids were up in their PJs eating breakfast and already talking to me about all the fun things they wanted to do. After the parents left, I ushered the kids off to get changed. As I was cleaning up the breakfast dishes, I heard a loud bang come from the dining room. I ran back into the room and found one of the false ceiling tiles had fallen from its place. Puzzled, I tried to put it back, but it was not an easy task. After some struggling, I managed to fit it back in, and thought to myself, how could that have fallen out on its own? The day went on, and now it's close to lunchtime. The kids are watching TV, and I'm in the kitchen making something for lunch when I heard another loud bang coming from the dining area again. I look, and sure enough, the same tile was on the floor. This time, I left it for the parents to see when they got home. Maybe they can fix it, I thought. Now the kids wanted to play hide and seek. We started off with Cameron seeking, and myself and Devin hiding. As Cameron started to count, we scurried around trying to find the best hiding place. I found the downstairs bathroom to be the best place for me. It was easy enough for Cameron to find me, and I hid Devin close to me so that I could keep an eye on him. As I entered the bathroom, I closed the door quietly behind me. I walked a few steps into the room and was now facing the mirror. As I was looking at my reflection, I also noticed something behind me that was moving. It was the closet door directly behind me, slowly opening. The closet door opened halfway and then slowly closed again, all by itself. I had the same feeling come over me like I did when I was upstairs on my first day. Wide-eyed with fear, I turned to the bathroom door and ran out. All I could think was, what just happened? I was really starting to worry that this house was haunted, and I now had every horror movie that I had ever watched playing through my head. Now I'm finding that I'm really uncomfortable, but I decide it's best to keep occupied. I break out a board game for us to play on the living room floor. Hungry Hippo, I think it was. We were playing for around 20 minutes before I noticed something again out of the corner of my eye, moving. I turned my head to see what it was. A child's shoe was tumbling across the floor all by itself. The kids stopped and watched in confusion. I was in disbelief. Cameron let out a scream and she ran for the door. I grabbed up Devin and followed. We went to my friend's house next door and told her mom everything. I'm not sure if she believed me, but we stayed over there until the parents got home. When they showed up, we told them what we saw. I don't think they believed me either. I showed the panel that fell out. Apparently it's been an issue since they moved in, and as for the rest of my accounts, they chalked it up to an overly active imagination. I know what I saw and what I felt. I wasn't imagining anything. I later found out a bit of history on the house. Apparently, a man died in the house after a heart attack upstairs in a room above the dining room where the paneling kept falling out. I think that his spirit is still in that house, and that maybe he was just trying to play with us. This is the only time I have ever had a threatening contact or experience. In June of 2019, me and a friend had decided to go with our girlfriends on a camping trip. It's the day of, and we're packing all of our things into the car. We finally get everything loaded and get into the car and put the address in the GPS. We set off, and after 3 hours of driving and 45 minutes of hearing my friend and his girl argue, we finally arrive. We get out of the car, and me and my friend begin to unload. After getting my stuff, I begin to gather my girlfriend's things. As I was, my friend was asking his girlfriend why she needed 3 bags for a one-night camping trip. She smiled and opened one of them, which contained an ounce of pot and other paraphernalia. The other 2 bags had her favorite snacks and clothes. Now knowing that we had weed, we had to find a place to camp that wasn't near any other people. It took until sundown, but we discovered the perfect spot. We decided that after we got everything taken care of, we would eat hot dogs and smoke. We started to build a campfire to light the area so that we could set up our tents, but ran out of wood immediately. I said that I would go get some while my friend stayed with the girls. I set off on my journey, and after about 2 minutes I find some sticks to use. I start picking them up, and all of a sudden, I felt someone grab my wrist. I looked up to see a very pale, strange-looking man wearing a blank expression. For a man, he also had surprisingly long fingernails. He was digging them into my wrist while trying to grab my other wrist. I turned my head to not see his face and screamed for help, and my friends shouted a response, saying that they were coming. After they shouted, I immediately felt relief in my wrist. I wasn't struggling to keep my arms down, so I turned and ran as fast as I could, horrified. I met up with my friends and said that we had to leave immediately. I didn't even bother to explain myself. I just wanted gone. We loaded back up and took the long walk back. We get to the car and load our bags into it. I explained what happened as we were walking back, and it scared them enough to make them want to hustle. I had a picture of my wrist right after, but my iPhone broke and my cloud wasn't backed up, so I lost it. I do have a picture of it now, though. It has since then become a scar, which shows just how much force he was using. It was absolutely terrifying. When I was 14, I went camping in the summer with the Girl Guides. We only traveled a few miles away to a place that we had visited a few times for game nights. Each year, our guides would merge with the 2 others in the area for a huge campout that lasted about 5 days. The place we were staying in was rumored to have a ghost in the main house. The story says that it only shows itself to members of the family. We were staying on the large estate near the woods, right away from the house. I had been there quite a lot, and knew the grounds pretty well, which was awesome. I was staying in a tent with the younger girls. They were aged 10 to 13, because I didn't have my own tent like the other older girls. The first night went by smoothly. We built a climbing frame, lit candles in the dark, and pretended that we had landed on an alien planet. It was a silly, fun game. The next morning, me and one of the other girls get up early. Our group job was to collect firewood for breakfast, so we ventured into the woods on our own. We were joking around, grabbing sticks and stuff as we walked along. We ended up at the obstacle course and decided to play on it for a while, even though it was out of bounds. When we were done, we grabbed the firewood and started walking back to camp. The woods, to me, they felt and looked strange. It was as if the place was slightly different. I decided to start trying to scare the girl that I was with, just messing around, trying to spook her because it was funny to me. She got really scared and ran off and left me behind. I wasn't bothered as I slowly walked back. That was when I saw movement to my left, and then again up ahead. As I was about to leave the woods, I saw a man out of the corner of my eye. He was wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, carrying something long. I think it was a shotgun. There was no one there. I just shrug it off. Stuff like that doesn't bother me. I've seen strangers out in the woods before. Once out of the forest, everything goes back to normal. I looked back and the woods were as they should have been. Not like they were moments ago. I don't know how to explain it. They just seemed newer for a while. Not as wild, I guess, but everything was kind of grainy, misty, except that there was no mist. So I don't think anything of it. I enjoy the campout, we play games, sing songs, and just have a good time. On the second to last day, we play the game. We landed on the alien planet, and once we had breakfast, we had to go hide in the woods, build a shelter, a fire to make food, and people had to go steal food from the campsite without being seen. I am left in the woods on my own for ages as the other girls go around gathering the food. I built a pretty awesome shelter, but I realized I needed my penknife, which I had left in my tent, so I went to go get it. I get to the tent to find the kids that I was sharing it with crying their eyes out, terrified. Eventually, I get the story out of them. They had been making their food when a man, wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, had appeared and then vanished in front of them where I had seen him. I assured the kids that it was fine, and that it couldn't hurt them, and they eventually went back into the woods, but they were obviously very shaken. I got the blame for telling them a scary story, but I had only tried to scare that one girl at the very start and hadn't mentioned anything about the man to anyone. That night was the campfire. As it ended, we all ran through the pitch-black woods back to camp, leaving the person looking after us all alone in the forest. She had a light, so it was no big deal. She had to make sure that the fire was out as well. I found out a week after that she had been horrified walking back to camp and refused to go back into the woods again after that. She has refused to camp at that site ever since, but she won't tell us what she saw. The last day, I got bored while packing everything up. After all that had happened, I was in a ghost hunting mood, so me and 2 of the other girls go into the trees. I'm in the lead, and I'm walking along a path. I stopped and heard footsteps in front of us. clear footsteps walking on dead leaves, but no one was there. No one was anywhere near us. I followed the sounds along a path. Someone had heavy boots on. It was so bizarre. We all had trainers on. The girls I was with were silent. They could hear it as well. I followed the sounds around to a clearing at the very edge of the woods, where it stopped. I decided to sit down in the grass. The others followed me, but they sat behind me because they were scared at this point. I do the whole, "If anyone is there, could you give me a sign?" routine. As I finished, a white mist suddenly fell over the woods. You could see things moving behind it, though nothing was clear. It hung in the air as the other two girls ran off screaming. I sat for a minute and watched before saying thank you. As I said this, it was as if a gust of wind hit, and it disappeared. There was no wind. It was just amazing. That was the last of the strange stuff for that camping trip. We had to finish packing up and left the camp that afternoon. I've been back a few times since, and nothing else strange has happened. The woods have always felt normal. A few years after that, I found out that I'm actually related to the family who owned the house and estate. I'm always curious if the activity picked up because I was staying on the grounds. It's been 4 or 5 years since my last encounter. I think I'm safe, right? Wrong. I moved last year and I recently thought, hey, remember those kids a few years ago? Funny, they can't get you now. Boy, was I ever incorrect. I live on a mountain, and like an hour away from the beach in a super populated neighborhood with my roommates. 2 chill lesbians and a college dude. Super cool people. I think nothing can hurt me now, because there are people everywhere. But no, I'm stupid and jinx myself. I was home 2 days ago. Class was canceled, and the dude of the house was home too and taking a nap. I'm in the kitchen watching Netflix and doing homework when there's a knock on the window. Obviously, this is weird as hell, but I have weird as hell friends. Maybe one of them are trying to scare me. I brush it off and continue what I was doing, and then it happens again. Once again, I brush it off because maybe it was the snow if it wasn't one of my friends. Things like this happen all the time with them. Well, it goes on for about 10 minutes, and I'm kinda starting to freak out. My friends don't have this much patience. I go to Charlie's room, the guy, and wake him up. I'm not the one that's usually riled up, so he's concerned too. We both go to the window. I have my phone out with the camera and 911 within a touch, and Charlie has a bat. We look out the window, and no one is there. After a minute, we calm down and go and sit in the living room. Charlie's mom is a cop, so he says he'll tell her about it later. We think we're okay, so we chill and watch TV together. 30 minutes later, the doorbell rings. I go and open the door. At first, I don't see anything. Then, down on the bottom of the stairs of the apartment, I see 3 young boys dressed in black hoodies, jeans, with brown or black bangs. At first I didn't move, I was frozen in place. Then Charlie asked who it was, and I came to my senses and got a good look at the kids, then slammed the door shut behind me. I started bawling, and I mean sobbing. I had no clue what to do. Charlie's freaking out because I don't cry, especially in front of people like that. He ran to the door with the bat that we have on the windowsill and looked outside. He saw them too. He started freaking out because he didn't know what to do, so he started yelling at them to leave. He said they started smiling. I was crying even more now, and he was still screaming, and I think the neighbors wanted to call the cops. Now think about this. He didn't know what they were. He thought they were normal kids that had scared me. He didn't see their eyes yet. I started yelling at him to go inside when I hear a bunch of footsteps running up the stairs and Charlie screams and runs in. He's telling me he saw their eyes and that they were black and now we're both freaking out and grabbing kitchen knives. Eventually we calm down and look outside again. No one's there, but we can see a group of kids past the complex with 3 that we think might have been the BEKs. I told him about the other thing that happened to me, and now we're scared to be in this house. We told the other roommates, and they thought we were high or something, so once again, no one believes me. This happened about 3 days ago, and I've been on edge ever since. So for some backstory, my mother has breast cancer, and before our town got a cancer treatment center at the hospital, my mother would have to travel to a city 4 hours away to get treatment. At times, this would be 3 days. She would leave, get treated, and then come back on the 3rd day. At this time, my brother was in his early teens and was going through that rebellious stage of his life. So guess who gets called to look after him when my mother does her treatments? Day 1. My mother leaves early, about 6 in the morning, and tells me that she would send me a text message once she gets to her hotel. I came around yesterday so that my mother could leave early and told her to have a safe trip. Eventually, my brother wakes up to get ready for school. This is on a Friday. I give him his lunch, and he's off. I spend my day just sitting around my mother's house, giving her cat some attention, giving the dog some food, watching TV. The basics, really. Sure enough, my brother returns back from school and we do the typical brother things. Night comes, he goes to bed, and I stay up for a little while watching TV. About 10, I turn it off and make my way to the spare room where I was staying while Mom was away. I get underneath the blanket and close my eyes. As I could feel myself on the verge of sleep, I hear it. Thud, 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 thud. It was the sound of footsteps, as though someone was quickly moving back and forth through the living room. My eyes shot open, and my thoughts quickly went to burglar. Someone was in my mother's house, moving around, trying to find something to steal. But as I listened, I noticed something else. I would hear it, then a pause, and then again, like someone was running back and forth, only stopping for a moment just to do it all over. The sound was too light for a grown person, but sounded more like that of a child. I sighed, believing this to be my brother. My mom had told me before she left about how my brother would sneak out of his room to grab his phone or Game Boy and play it when he was meant to be sleeping. Thinking this was the case, I get out of bed and make my way into the living room. As I did, the noise stopped. I continued on up to my brother's room. I opened the door and peeked in. He looked like he was sleeping, but looks can be deceiving. I returned to the living room and I decided to pretend to have fallen asleep on the couch so that I could catch my brother in action. Somehow I actually did fall asleep. I awoke to something brushing my nose. Turns out it was the dog. I look around to see the slightest of light coming in the windows. If I had to guess, it was maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. Tired, I get up and make my way back to bed. Once again, as I felt myself about to drift off, the noises started up again. In my tired state, I just concluded that it must be possums in the roof, and went back to sleep. Day 2. It was Saturday, so I let my brother sleep in. The lazy butthole didn't get up until 11. It went well. We hung out, had lunch, played some games, nothing really major. Well, not until that night. Once again, I stayed up while my brother went to bed, and again, around 10, I turned the TV off and went to go to sleep. Sure enough, just as I was about to drift off, thud, 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 thud. Those darn possums, I moaned to myself. Then I heard a little girl giggle. My eyes shot open after hearing that, and the running resumed. I sat up, hearing the playful running back and forth in the living room. I just sat there trying to figure out where this little girl's giggle had come from. It sounded like a 7 or a 10-year-old. I turned to the window, seeing the next-door neighbor's light still on. I began to think that the noise I was hearing was coming from them, that maybe they had a little girl over and she was just being a pest. It was a good possibility, except for one thing. The couple who lived there were old and didn't have any grandkids. I heard that giggle again much clearer now, like it was just in the living room, which was just outside my door. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Day 3. That morning I was uneasy, but was glad that my mother was returning. About 1 p.m. she got back home, and I began to pack up to return home myself, but the events of the past 2 nights still stuck with me as I returned back to her. Getting the courage, I asked her if she had ever heard a little girl in that house. "Oh, her?" my mother states. "Yeah, she's quite a mischievous one, isn't she?" I just smiled and left. I spent other nights there looking after my brother, but never heard from her again, and when my mother moved to another house with another ghost, I felt like she traded one for another. But that's a different story. In high school, my friends and I knew a guy named Gene. For whatever reason, Gene had a habit of telling extremely tall tales centered on himself, as if he were trying to make himself look cooler. The most repeated one was his claim that in a nearby ravine, a coven of druids practiced and were schooling him in ancient magic. He always played them straight, as if they were unquestionably true. He never had any evidence. While taking a walk one night, I happened upon a construction site. Being heavily into urban exploration, I explored the heck out of that site, and upon leaving, tipped over their porta potty. I was still a bit immature, and I thought it was funny. After that, whenever I found one, over it went. One day I told some friends about it, and Gene, ever the showman, chimed in with, "Oh, that's nothing. I like to burn them down." Arson was most assuredly not our thing, and we knew that Gene was full of it, so we were just surprised when, calling his bluff, he offered to prove it by showing us the fruits of his labors. 5 of us piled into the car, only one of us had a car, and followed Gene's instructions. The site was in a rural area with lots of big hills and dense forest, common in the Pacific Northwest. At a sharp elbow on a 2-lane road was a gravel turnoff leading maybe 100 feet into the woods to a gravel parking lot. This was the starting point for a number of hiking trails. There were no lights there, and the street light out on the road didn't show very much through the trees. Also, there were no other cars. One of the trails began past a gate that was designed to keep off-roaders from the trails, and it took a sharp left turn from the back of the parking lot. The porta potty had been about 30 feet or so up the trail, and on a later visit by day, we found out that Gene really did burn it into a puddle of blue goo. That night, we didn't make it there. We had a couple of flashlights, and we all started up the trail as a group. As far as I can recall, we never heard any noises, animal or human. We got about halfway to the spot, then all of us stopped walking. Someone whispered, "Do you feel that?" And we all bolted down the trail, piled back into the car, and got the hell out of there. Once on the road, we compared thoughts. I felt what everyone else did. The deepest, most intense, raw fear that I have ever endured. It was like we suddenly faced impending death. It clearly indicated, I need to leave right this instant. I can only guess that there might have been a cougar or something, as they've been known to attack hikers, but we saw and heard absolutely nothing. I've read that if a little voice in your head tells you to do something, it's a good idea to listen. Part of me wonders if Gene's porta potty fire pissed off some forest spirit or something. I've been back to that trailhead a few times during the day to show friends where this happened. I've also brought a friend who's quote-unquote sensitive, as they say, and they didn't pick up anything. I've had a few odd experiences, including seeing a couple of ghosts, some strange lights in the sky several times, and some other stuff. This is the only unexplainable experience that I've had which was deeply scary. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail that I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to set up my tent. I stumble upon this nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking, kind of dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it and put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that, and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even in my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book that I brought with me and start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by and I hear the sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal walk/drag across the clearing toward my tent. It was really loud at this point, and now it sounds as if the hooves are being really heavily planted, with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along behind it. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing and stops, and I hear nothing. No breathing. Not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness. What on earth? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and sit there listening for other noises. There was just crickets and the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods, and I tried to not let it bother me. Besides, I did have my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, followed by women's laughter and sticks snapping off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. Then I hear more faint laughing from a couple other different directions, all sounding like different people, and confirm that this is real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire off a warning shot into the air in case they come too close. Something about this laughter, how far in the woods that I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night, told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, seeing nothing. I listened intently to my surroundings. There was no more laughing, and the forest sounds had returned. I relaxed just a bit, and figuring that I had scared whoever off, I sat down, and in my exhausted state, I fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering, not very far from my tent. Alert, I grab my rifle again and listen to what they were saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" The voices fall silent. I call out again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Suddenly a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people that were just standing around. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise, back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. I never heard anyone follow me. I never saw anyone or anything the entire time, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me. I left all my gear in the woods that night. I went camping on a hiking trail in the Shawnee State Forest. During the day, I set up camp and went fishing in a creek running along next to the campsites. Most of the day, I felt fine and peaceful. I tend to feel at home in the woods alone and fly fishing. I started a fire, started on dinner over the fire before it got dark, and stoked the fire. Once it got dark, I felt compelled to keep the fire stoked, and a feeling of panic would set in if it even began to die down. I couldn't relax. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. It got to the point where I just grabbed my light and walked out, leaving all of my stuff there. I got out to the parking lot about 1.5 miles away and tried to steel my nerves and go back, but couldn't step past the tree line. I waited all the way until morning to go back to get my stuff, and the feeling was gone. I got everything together and left. Haven't been back since. I don't know if it was a ghost or a native spirit, since this place is deep in what used to be Shawnee tribe land. I had a strange babysitting experience the other night. Everything was normal until the kids were in bed, and so I was just scrolling through random vids on Instagram to pass the time. I was watching one, and I heard something. It was as if a man or one of the boys pretending to have a deep voice was upstairs, said "no" or something in a weirdly growly voice. I was confused and a little spooked, so I brushed it off and sat on the couch to watch a movie. Their dog was walking around and growling at the windows that led to the backyard. That creeped me out too, but again, I just brushed it off as the dog seeing a squirrel or something. At this point, it's around 10 p.m. He then was laying on my lap and started growling and barking toward the kitchen. At this point, I was like, come on, man, you better cut that out. Because who on earth wouldn't be creeped out by that? Later, I heard these incredibly light, whispery voices like children. I wasn't completely sure if it was just the kids waking up and making noise, but it only lasted for a moment after I noticed. I noticed those weird things, but I really didn't put them together until later that night. I talked to my mom after, and she told me that my sister and her friend had babysat there as well, and they both had an odd experience, i.e. bad vibes, the kids telling her that she's seen some things, and the kids actually addressing something that wasn't there. My mom didn't tell me before so that I wouldn't be spooked, which I guess was good because I got an independent witness of whatever happened without being influenced by other people's experiences. But anyways, that's what took place. I'll still go back and babysit. I'll just be prepared to throw hands with Casper. I totally forgot about this happening until my mom brought it up at dinner tonight, and now it's 9:30 at night and I'm scared all over again. This was back in high school, either my freshman or sophomore year. I missed the bus, and I didn't have a car at the time, so my mom had to drive me to school. The road my tiny neighborhood, more like a glorified cul-de-sac, was off of was a long stretch that had only one equally tiny other neighborhood and a few houses here and there. It was 6 a.m. or something and still dark outside, and it was colder than a witch's tit. As we were pulling out of the neighborhood, my mom and I both saw these 3 children in blue and white private school uniforms standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder at the entrance of the neighborhood on the sidewalk. It was either 2 girls and 1 boy or 2 boys and 1 girl. I didn't remember the ratio, but the girls wore a blue and white skirt/dress outfit and the boy wore a blue short-sleeved shirt with khaki shorts. This was weird for a few reasons. 1, it was 40 degrees outside. They looked like they were dressed for the summer, and they didn't even wear coats or anything. Secondly, there were 2 schools in the area, but not a private school till the next town over, and the blue and white weren't the school's uniform colors. Third, what young kids just stand there in a single file line not doing anything but staring? No joshing around? No nothing? Yeah, right. Lastly, this wasn't where the bus stop was. It was a few blocks down. Just a sprinkle of extra creepy on top. There weren't any streetlights. They were just standing there in the dark, not doing jack except for being creepy as hell. They were on the corner on the right, closest to the passenger side where I was obviously sitting. And of course, we were turning right. As we got closer, I thought that at first they didn't have faces, but it was just too shadowy and dark out, and the headlights only shone under their shoulders, which is how I can remember the outfits so vividly. Then we got closer, and I was relieved to see that they did have faces, but then got completely freaked all over again when I saw that their eyes were all black. Like supernatural Sam and Dean fighting demons, all black. My mom saw it before I did, and she put the pedal to the metal and hightailed it out of there. I remember trying to look back and see them, but I couldn't since it was too dark. My mom didn't go back home until the sun rose, and it was bright enough to not be afraid anymore. Of course, no one believed me at school, and my siblings thought we were just full of it, but we know what we saw. We never saw them again after that, though. I thought that they were spirits. But after a few months, I heard about the black-eyed children on YouTube, or something that made the connection. We moved shortly after that due to unrelated reasons. This was 3 or 4 years ago, and I had blissfully forgotten all about it until my mom said, "Hey, remember when?" And now I want to die. I hope that my irrational anxieties and fear around children that are small enough for me to punt across the soccer field is amusing at least. Me and my friends went into the forest that's in my backyard. We went at least 5 minutes deep into the woods, down to a stream. We looked across the stream and saw a log, or at least what we thought was a log. It might have been, but one of us pointed out that it seemed to have turned its head. We ran as fast as we could back out of there. This was during a sleepover. We went to sleep around 3, but I ended up waking up around 4 after hearing a noise. I saw a shadowy figure that immediately disappeared once I laid eyes on it. I haven't seen anything else since. It could have just been my imagination, but I could have sworn that I did in fact see it. And it had the same outline as what we saw from a distance earlier that afternoon. My friends and I told me that I was just being paranoid, but I don't think I was. So I checked it out again in the same place, and the log figure was gone. So I still feel as if that thing were not after me, but after one of my friends. 2 years later, and still, I haven't heard or seen anything of it. Although every now and then, I do get the feeling that I'm being watched. I've been getting a little less sleep, but I think that might just be the fact that my sleep schedule is trying to adjust, but I still don't know what that thing is, and whether or not it was real, or if it was just part of my mind playing tricks on me. But again, I don't think that that was it. Remember when I said I hadn't seen anything of it since? Well, I lied. The other day I went back into the forest, and there it was, in the same position that me and my friends had seen it in 2 years ago. I brought them over there, and they confirmed that they were seeing the same thing. It did not look over this time, but I've had an uneasy feeling ever since. They started to stop with the feeling 1 year afterward, but when I saw it a few days ago, the uneasy feeling increased. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I don't like it. It's not anything I've seen in any paranormal YouTube videos or anything else about the paranormal, which leads me back to believing that it wasn't real. But my friends confirmed that it was real, and I'm not questioning what they said. So it was real, and it was scary. I hope the uneasy feeling goes down soon, and if the thing ever comes near my house again, I'm going to call the police. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the morning after the sleepover, I saw not footprints, but something else that I can't quite put my finger on. Something that no human foot could ever have made. I have no idea what it was, and don't plan on trying to figure it out. When I was younger, my mama would leave me home alone with my older brothers. As soon as she would leave, they would pull out a hidden Ouija board and play around on it. Of course, I wasn't allowed to be part of the game. I was probably around 6 or 7, and they were in their late teens. I can remember so vividly these memories. Mama left, and the boys went into a bedroom off the kitchen where the board was hidden. They closed the door behind them, and I was left watching cartoons by myself in the living room. The bedroom door had a gap under it, about 1.5 inches tall, and I would sometimes quietly go lay on the floor and watch them play with it through the gap. I can remember them making contact with a spirit one night, and they asked its name, to which it replied, Tobias. Each time they played after that, it always seemed to be Tobias reaching out. For about a week they conversed with this spirit, and nothing out of the ordinary seemed to come from it. However, one night, as I was watching them, the board started talking about me. My brothers would always write down the things being communicated and read them aloud, which made it easy for me to eavesdrop on them. As I lay there on the kitchen floor looking under the door, the game became active and my brothers started writing. I saw both of them make eye contact and look at each other, confused. My oldest brother said, "It said we are being watched?" As they looked around the room, I snuck back to my cartoons. They opened the door and checked on me, then went back into the room. I crept back over to watch some more. This time, the board used my name. I recall my brother saying, "It says Bianca needs to go away." I could feel the blood leave my face. I knew my brothers hadn't seen me watching. I got up and pretended to be sleeping on the couch, and eventually just actually did fall asleep there. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a strange sound, kind of like the sound a cat makes in its throat when it's mad. I sat up and cleaned the sleep from my eyes. After sitting there in the dark for a moment, it seemed to go quiet in the house. I was getting ready to get up and go to the bathroom, but I felt unable to stand, almost like something was pushing down on my shoulders. Then suddenly, it was like I was in a wind tunnel. I remember Mama's sheer curtains were whirling around, and it felt like they filled the room. I felt so dizzy, and then it just stopped. I don't remember going to sleep at all, but I woke up on the same couch, and it was daylight outside. I have never spoken about this to anyone, but the story doesn't end there. My brothers continued to mess around with the board, which I was no longer wanting to be around. It got to the point that weird things were happening to them, too. They would talk about it amongst themselves, and I would play oblivious. One night, my brothers walked out of the bedroom with a rolled-up sheet and scissors. They told me that they would be right back and walked out the door. The next morning, I learned that the board had said some things that really frightened them. They took it down the road to the old iron bridge near our house to cut it up and throw it over into the water. We were all sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast when we heard a loud crash outside. we ran out to see a car had wrecked on the bridge. My brothers were sure it was because of the Ouija spirit that they thought they had disposed of the night before. The person who wrecked happened to be a person that my brother went to school with. He told my brother that he wrecked because as he was driving over the bridge, a demon-like figure appeared next to him in the car. He later found a piece of the board in his car, and nobody knows how it got there. This happened about 2 weeks ago while my brother and his wife were at a party. My own wife and I get called to babysit my nephews and nieces for these sorts of moments by all of my siblings. In this instance, when we were asked to babysit my 5-year-old nephew, his 3-year-old sister, and his 6-month-old brother, we happily obliged. They live in a newish, 10-year-old house, and the only significant location near it is an important cultural site for the local Cree peoples about 10 kilometers away. The hard work was done for us, as the 5- and 3-year-old were asleep upstairs before we arrived. The baby was not fussy but would not sleep, so we were hanging out with him on the main floor. As the night dragged on, around 10:30 I heard a baby crying upstairs. Thinking the 3-year-old must have woken, I left the happy baby with my wife and went to check on our niece. My wife heard the crying as well and asked me to go check. On my way up the flights of stairs, I definitely heard crying from that floor, and I pushed my head into the kids' room to listen. The crying was still going on, but both kids were sound asleep. The sound was coming from across the hall, the nursery, so being quite confused, I moved toward that room. The crying ceased about midway between the door and the crib. Seeing the room was empty, I immediately began trying to explain it to myself. I picked up the baby monitor unit in the room to make sure that it wasn't picking up an errant signal from another house. It was not on, and didn't have a speaker anyways. There were no toys that made that noise around, and no TVs or devices that might play those noises in the room. I stuck around to listen a while longer, but nothing came of it. My wife was baffled and a little spooked, as she had clearly heard the crying as well. Nothing happened the rest of that night, and my nephew is still just the same wonderful kid that he has always been, so I guess no harm, no foul, spooky ghost. My brother and his wife went white when I told them about it at Christmas, but to my knowledge, it is the only thing like that that has ever happened in their house. His house has no history and had also been smudged, so no advice is necessary from anyone. I just thought y'all might appreciate a wholesome, unexplained experience. "10 years ago, when I was about 16, I started babysitting for a family that lived in my neighborhood. They had a sweet 7-month-old baby girl that I would babysit every now and then, and 2 dogs that were also very nice. Despite them having a nice house in a nice neighborhood, I still got a very weird feeling when I was in their home. It was almost like I was being watched or felt a presence there. Whenever I took care of the baby or their dogs, I would never want to spend longer there than needed. One night while babysitting her, about 2 years old, she asked to go down to their basement to play with Play-Doh. I said yes, and we went downstairs. I got a very weird feeling when we went down there, but I still got out the Play-Doh for her. We were playing for about 2 minutes before she came over to me and said that she was scared. I asked why she was scared, and she said that the man was scaring her. I said, "What?" Because I thought that I had heard her wrong the first time, and she said very clearly, "The man is scaring me." She then asked to go upstairs, and I said yes, and she bolted and ran up the stairs and left me to clean up the Play-Doh. About 6 months after that, the family asked me to care for the dogs while they were out of town, and I said yes. I ended up burning some sage and asking the spirit to leave the space. After that, I didn't feel the presence as strongly. It was to this day such a weird experience, and I still have no explanation for why that all happened. I have lived in my apartment for 3 years now, and other than things falling randomly that I would usually blame on my cats, I have never experienced anything paranormal. My boyfriend claims to see white lights at night in our bedroom, but I don't know. I feel there is always a logical explanation for things. Yesterday, I felt particularly spooked in my apartment, and I felt like someone was behind me, like felt a presence. But also, I am a fat baby when it comes to these things, so I never take myself seriously. Anyway, this is where it gets weird. That night, my phone rang. I was expecting a call from my best friend, so I pick up and say hello. What I heard was a doll-like voice, laughing and giggling. She has a 1-year-old daughter who does not sound like that, but I just assumed it was her, so I was like, "Aw, hi!" All the while being creeped the F out and wondering what her daughter, who goes to bed at 8, was doing up at 12 a.m. Then it quickly cut to my friend and she was like, "Was that you? What are you doing? Tell me, are you joking with me?" I felt the blood leave my face. I was like, "No, what did you hear?" Thinking she heard the same thing, or maybe some static. She was in shock. She told me she heard a demonic man voice say, "Hello," clearly, and then cut to me saying hello. We spent the next few minutes arguing, as she thought I was joking with her and I thought she was joking with me, even though she was not the type of person to do something like that. We established that it could have just been a weird glitch or something and left it at that. I am so spooked from this though. Has anyone experienced something like it? I never heard a sound like that in my life, other than maybe in movies. I'm glad she heard something too, because I feel like no one would have believed me. I don't usually get static or anything on my cell phone. Neither of us were watching something on it beforehand, and the sounds we heard were clear as day. Help me find a logical explanation. On Labor Day of 2015, my mother, my wife, 3 children, and I went to a very remote cabin that we had rented out. It was an old fire watchman station or something of the sort, so it had the cabin and 3 other sheds and shops. I'll try to keep it short now, but this is a really bizarre story. We unpacked, settled into the cabin, and decided to take a walk a couple of 100 yards down to the river. We were all barefoot wearing sandals with shorts. We got down to the pebbled shore and were playing, throwing rocks, etc., when I realized that there were 1-foot snakes everywhere. My wife, mom, and I yanked up the 3 kids and boogied off. After reaching a safe distance, I went back with a water bottle and caught one of them to see what it was. It turns out we were in a nest of diamondback rattlesnakes. If one of those things had latched onto one of my kids, then surely they would have died. We were about 3 hours away from any medical facility. We got back to the cabin and my mom and I went for a hike alone while my wife calmed the kiddos and fed them lunch. Upon returning about 15 minutes later, all 3 of my wife and kids were inside with the doors and windows all closed, even though we had opened everything up to cool the place off. We went inside to hear all 4 of them start yelling about a bear that was about 150 yards from the cabin, huffing and puffing at the wife and kids on the front porch while they were eating. It was down by the river, another 30 yards or so down the hill. A few hours go by, and in that time, an ATV passed 3 times, with 2 inbred-looking freaks on it, and each time they stopped in front of the gate onto the property and stared at us or the cabin. Keep in mind, again, we're hours into the wilderness in Idaho with no sight of a person the entire trip except for them. We decide it's bedtime for the kiddos, as it's pitch black out. Within 10 minutes, our son, who was 5 at the time, went from being perfectly fine, active, and talkative to having a fever of 103 degrees, slightly foaming at the mouth, and being completely unresponsive. That was it. We were leaving immediately and going to seek medical attention. I opened the front door of the cabin to start loading the 2 cars, and that's when we heard 3 adults and what sounded like 4 or 6 large, heavy animals running all around the cabin and property. There was one on the right side of the house, when exiting, that I could hear pacing back and forth, breathing heavily. I made everyone stay inside and close the door every time I went out to transfer stuff into the vehicles, which took me about 4 to 5 trips. I had a stick in a big pot that I was smacking as hard and loud as I could each time and was yelling loudly at random. As soon as I finished the loading, I took out each kid individually and loaded them into the cars. Then I escorted out my mom, and then my wife. My wife and I were in the lead car, so we pulled up out of the gate, and for some stupid reason or other, I felt that I needed to close it. I got out of my vehicle and walked behind it, and my mom's car by about 15 feet, and closed the gate. Now, this gate is literally a log that slides from one post to the other. It offered zero protection or barrier between me and the animals that sounded like they were out there. Right as I went to turn around, I heard loud padded footsteps walking up to me. Directly in front of me, no more than 10 feet, I see eyes shimmering from the moonlight as the deepest, scariest growl I have ever heard in my life rumbles through the air. I turned and ran so fast I swear that I must have jumped from where I was to the driver's seat of my car some 30 feet in front of me. As I landed in my seat, I slammed it into drive and spun out, finally leaving. It gets weirder and scarier, though. About 15 minutes down the road, we were still panicking about our unresponsive son. We both kept having this horrible, evil doom kind of feeling, like a shadow over us. I looked down and realized that I still had that baby rattlesnake in the water bottle in my cup holder, so I grabbed it and threw it out the window immediately. Not even 2 minutes later, we softly hear our son begin to cry. We realize that he's become responsive, and he stated something along the lines of, "Why are we leaving? What's going on?" He was crying because he was sad to leave. He couldn't even remember the last hour. The next day, my mom broke down extremely badly, sobbing her eyes out, and was hardly able to even speak. She confessed to my wife that the night before we left, she had a nightmare in which we went on the camping trip. We came across snakes, a bear, and a pack of wolves. She said that she knew a lot of bad things happened at that outpost, and that it was full of evil. Most of all, she said that one of our kids died. I swear on my life to this very day, if I ask her who died and how it happened, she immediately starts crying and refuses to tell me, or anyone else, anything more. She lives her life now with a guilt that she willingly ignored her premonition and put us in that situation, nearly taking the life of one of her dearest grandkids away. She doesn't deserve to feel like that. I know this all sounds insane, but a week later on the local news were reports of a wolf pack in that area. Wolves and bears may not coexist in harmony, but they do share territories and tend to respect each other. This outpost station of sorts was 1.5 hours into the wilderness from Loman Banks, Idaho, if you want to verify that these animals actually exist around there. I grew up in the mountains for most of my pre-early teen years, as did my wife until she was 10 years old. I even have half a sleeve of the wilderness and trees on my left arm. With that said, we don't care to go to the mountains anymore. When I was like 13, my mom and her boyfriend had to go to the hospital, and no one would be able to get my brother to the bus stop the next morning because they had to stay overnight. So, I got to miss school the next day to take my brother. After I made sure my brother got on the bus, I went home and cleaned and did random stuff, like a 13-year-old would do. It was around 11:45 when there was a knock on my door. Thinking it was the mailman or a neighbor or something, I opened the door and said hello. There was this kid. He couldn't have been much older than me at the time, but he had bangs that were covering his eyes, which I found weird because it was like 107 degrees out. So this kid was super still. Like, I thought that one of my friends put a mannequin there and ran away or something. But then it spoke. It sounded like a robot or something. It was like it was programmed to say this. My mother said to ask someone for a phone in fear that I get lost. Do you have a phone? At this point, I was crapping my pants because 1, I'm a 13-year-old girl, and this older boy was dressed like a burglar and at my door with half his face covered. 2, for some reason, I just couldn't look away. I felt like if I moved or said anything other than yes, that I would explode. And 3, I saw 2 other boys around the same age standing in my driveway dressed exactly the same way as the one in front of me. Baggy jeans, dark hoodie, and scruffed up Vans. I began to stutter and shake my head. It was the only thing I could do. I finally got out a no and then started to close my door, but he put his foot in the way. Then the 2 others started walking up, and I was going, hell no. I grabbed the bat by the door and threatened him. If you don't leave right now, I'll kick your ass and then call the cops. I shouted loud enough so that at least one of my neighbors could hear, I hoped. Now, I was this short girl with SpongeBob pajama pants on. I was in no way intimidating. Then he moved his foot and stepped back into the middle of the other 2 perfectly. Then the far right one said in the exact same tone of voice as the first, I'm sorry to bother you. I'll just come again later and ask. Internally, I was planning my funeral. Just as I was about to close the door, the first one smiled and looked up. And that was when I saw that they had black eyes. Then the other 2 looked up, and they were the same. I was like, nope, and slammed the door shut, then called my neighbor, who was this big-ass 20-something-year-old dude. He ran over and looked for them all around my house, but he said they were gone. When I told my mom all of this, she didn't believe me and said I was lying. Said me, the girl with absolutely no social life, who was afraid of her own shadow, was lying. I've been a babysitter a bunch of times. Sometimes I take care of the kids of my mom's friends, other times I take care of my little cousins. I really liked to babysit all of my kids, because it usually went smoothly and none of them were problematic to deal with. One time I was babysitting my little cousins, who at the time were 6, 4, 2, and 5 months old. My aunt told me that the baby monitor needed new batteries, so I decided to just check on the baby from time to time. The night went as usual. The bigger kids ate dinner, played a bit, then watched some cartoons, and fell asleep a few minutes after. I was downstairs just texting with some friends and tried to listen carefully in case my baby cousin made any sounds. For most of the night, I thought I heard the baby making sounds, so I kept going in there and checking on him. I believed it was just my mind playing tricks on me, probably because I was on high alert, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the 2-year-old woke up crying because of a nightmare, so I grabbed him and let him lay on my chest until he fell asleep, and then I tucked him into bed again. A few minutes passed, and I heard the baby screaming, so I ran upstairs and did what I could to calm him down so that the other kids wouldn't wake up. As soon as I get to the door, the screaming stops, and when I entered the bedroom to check on him, he was sound asleep. I freaked out and checked everything in the nursery, hoping to find some kind of toy with a similar sound, but there was nothing. I immediately went and checked on the other kids, praying that they were okay. Fortunately, all 4 kids were asleep, and it appeared to have not disturbed anyone. Still, I made sure everything was all right, and that nothing had actually made a sound. I was kind of surprised that the scream hadn't woken any of the other kids up, but at the same time I was thankful for it, because I didn't want the other kids to be scared in their own house, and also I wouldn't know how to explain what had happened to my aunt and uncle without freaking them out. I didn't hear any other sounds for the rest of the night until my aunt and uncle came home. I decided to not say anything, and just take the money and go home. This is a completely true story. There was one time about 2 or 3 years ago. I was out in the woods camping with my brother, and we had just gotten there around 4 p.m. to set up and all. Once we had settled in, we got a fire going. I told my brother I was gonna go get some firewood because we only had enough to get it started. So I went out and it was around 7 p.m. Then I got really cold all of a sudden, even though the weather was not cold at all. When I got the sudden rush of coldness, I felt a heavy feeling of just pure evil, hatred, and despair. I immediately went back to my brother. He told me it was fine, that it was probably just a strong wind that had given me a chill. But I knew that something was wrong. We sat around the fire, and I just felt like someone or something was watching me. Once again, I started to feel the same feeling of evil, but this time faintly. It slowly started getting worse and worse, almost as if it were growing inside of me. I brushed it off and went back to bed. At around 2:20-ish in the morning, I heard something that sounded like a scream, and it woke me up. I looked around in the tent and got a flashlight. When I turned the light on, I noticed that my arm was bleeding and had been cut open by something in multiple spots. I woke my brother in a panic and told him what had happened. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, and my arm wasn't even cut, even though I was looking right at it and it was obviously slashed open and bleeding. I said, "Are you joking?" And he continued to say that nothing had happened to me and that I was just pranking him. At that moment, I felt a huge amount of pain in my arm, and then I heard the scream again, but it didn't sound like how a human would scream. It was more of a screech, as if there were an animal or some creature in the distance that was in pain. I looked at my brother and asked if he had heard it, and he asked me, "What do you mean did I hear that? There was nothing." At that point, I was afraid for my life. I was praying that nothing else would happen. But after a few minutes, I heard the scream again. Every time I heard it, I would feel that dread, that evil again, and my arm would start to have a burning sensation. Eventually, all of it stopped, although after that, I wasn't able to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my brother that I wanted to leave ASAP. When we went to get into the truck, I could have sworn out of the corner of my eye that I saw something run through the woods. I looked to the right while packing the stuff up, and 4 of the trees had marks like they had been clawed by something. But the thing is that the marks were at least 12 feet up in the trees, maybe higher. I was so tired and scared that I couldn't even think about it anymore. I just got into the truck, and we left. To this day, I still haven't gone camping again. When I was around 12 years old, my family and I moved into a semi-detached house just up the street from our previous home. The house wasn't very big, and the floor plans for our part of the house were completely different from our neighbors. Our neighbors were a lovely little family of 4. Husband is from England, wife from Norway, which is where I live. They also had a 3-year-old little girl and a 6-month-old baby boy. Now, I love children, always have, and at that time, I really wanted to start babysitting. It's quite common to start babysitting at age 12, and I was turning 13 a month later anyway, so I wanted to find some small job. As we got to know our neighbors over the next few months of living there, my parents told the neighbors that if they ever needed a sitter, then it would be nice if they would consider trying me out. Seeing as it would be my first job as a babysitter, we thought it would be smart to start with my next-door neighbors, seeing as my parents would literally be on the other side of the wall just in case anything happened. Cut to a Friday night when my neighbors went to a party that was happening just down the street. I got there at around 8 p.m., and the parents told me that they would come home at around 2 to 3 a.m. Both kids were already sleeping, so they told me to just put on a movie and relax. These kids were the easiest to babysit ever. Once you put them to bed and they fell asleep, absolutely nothing would wake them up. They are some of the heaviest sleepers I've ever seen, so babysitting them was usually pretty uneventful. I was on the couch watching Avatar in the living room on the second floor. The kids had their own separate bedrooms that were just downstairs where the front door was. I could basically see their bedrooms from where I was sitting, as the place was quite small. Because of the hallway, I couldn't see the front door. Again, this house was very small, so as long as the TV wasn't on too loud, then I could hear everything that happened downstairs. At around midnight, I heard the front door unlock, and my neighbors walked in while talking. I heard them close the door, and I heard them start taking off their jackets and their shoes. I thought it was a bit weird that they hadn't called to let me know that they were coming home early, but I just assumed that it must have slipped their minds, so I went downstairs to greet them. I could hear them talking up until the point that I came around the corner to the hallway that led to the door. There was no one there. The talking fell silent the second that I turned the corner. The only sound was from the TV upstairs. My heart started beating so fast, and my head was rushing. I ran to the bedrooms and checked the kids before I searched the rest of the house. I opened every door, checked every cabinet for anything that would explain what had just happened, but there was nothing there. The kids were still sound asleep. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. I checked the kids one last time and made certain that the doors were wide open so that I could see them from upstairs. I sat down to finish the movie whilst trying to process what had just taken place. But when I sat down, I noticed that the TV had been shut off, even though I had left it on. When I turned it back on, there was just snow on the screen. I couldn't for the life of me get it to work again. That's when the talking downstairs started up all over. Not only that, but the baby started screaming bloody murder. This baby never woke up from naps, and definitely wouldn't ever scream the way that it did that night. I have never in my life run down a staircase as fast as I did then. I rushed toward the baby's bedroom, only to find the door closed. I ripped it open, picked the baby up, and rushed to pick up his sister. I took them both upstairs and held those kids for almost 3 hours before the parents came back home. The talking and sounds downstairs came and went as I had the kids with me on the couch. I held them as close to me as I could and tried my best to help them stay asleep. As the parents came home, I was too scared to walk downstairs to greet them. I couldn't be sure if it was even actually them or not until they walked up the stairs where they found me clutching their children. Obviously, they noticed that I was upset and asked me what had happened. I honestly felt like I had lost my mind at that point, but I told them the story anyway. After I was finished, they told me that it wasn't the first time anything like that had happened there. Apparently, they heard voices all the time at night. I was kind of mortified that they didn't think to warn me before, but they said that they were sorry that this had happened to me, and the mom walked me home to my house. I slept with the lights on for almost a month after that. Believe it or not, I did go back and babysit those kids again. This is my story from about 4 years ago. I was on a camping trip with some friends when we decided to go a little bit further into the forest to get the best location at the river. We had some beers and went swimming. When it started to get dark, almost all of my friends wanted to go home. Only my buddies Flo and Laura stayed with me. We lit a fire and continued to drink beer. After some hours, I felt like I had to go to the toilet. No problem, even had toilet paper in my backpack. Our camp was located right at the river, and a big field of high grass separated us from the forest. I decided to go to the high grass right in front of the trees, so I grabbed my phone as a flashlight and grabbed the toilet paper and went in the direction of the forest. It was pitch black, and because of the branches of the trees, I couldn't even see into the forest with my flashlight. So I sat down with my back to the forest and started doing my business. I was about 160 feet away from my friends now and couldn't even hear them talking anymore. When I was almost finished, I heard a sound coming from behind me. It was like the rustle of dry leaves or the crackle of branches. I know it's the kind of horror movie stereotype. I stumbled and said, "Hello? Who's there?" 2 or 3 times. But no one answered. I thought it might be some kind of animal, so I screamed as loud as I could. But to my horror, this thing got even closer. I finished as fast as I could, which still felt like an hour to me, while the sound came closer and closer with each passing second. When I stood up and started running, the thing was so close that I expected it to grab me from behind as I tried to escape. So I ran as fast as I could, screaming and crying. When I arrived at our camp, I told my friends everything. They didn't really believe me, but they were pretty scared themselves. I was 17 at the time, big and muscular, and normally not the type of guy to cry. But this thing made me cry, and it would make me again. I could not sleep at all that night. I sat in my sleeping bag, the river to my back, while staring into the direction of the forest. There were no sounds or anything, just the sound of the wind and darkness. In the morning, we packed our stuff and made our way home. I won't go anywhere near that forest anymore. Jokes were often made about me, but I know what I heard, and I get the shivers right now just while writing this. In Germany, we have no dangerous animals living in the forests. But every animal in our forest would avoid contact with humans, especially when you shout at them. This was probably the scariest thing to happen to me in real life. It took place a couple months ago while I was sightseeing the West Coast. I was visiting a small, quiet beach town in Oregon called Newport. It's basically situated on a cliff, and then down below is the beach. The beach itself is basically empty, and it is huge. It goes on for endless miles and seems like something out of a movie. I've never seen something so vast in my whole life. Anyway, I had spent most of the entire day on the beach, and when it got dark, I climbed back up the cliff to where my car was. I had originally planned to sleep on the beach in a tent, but it was starting to rain, so I figured I would just sleep in my car. I had been traveling all over Oregon and California for the last month, seeing national parks and stuff, and sleeping in my car most nights anyway. And this was literally the perfect, quiet little beach town, so I figured no big deal. I got to my car, which was parked in this public lot for beachgoers at the top of the cliff. But next to my car was the sign that said no overnight parking that I hadn't seen before, so I figured, dang, I guess I'll just go to another spot close by. So I looked on the maps on my phone and saw that 10 minutes away on the outside of town was a nature preserve. As I mentioned earlier, I had been staying at national parks and stuff, so I figured that it would be a nice place to sleep. The weather was beginning to get significantly worse, and I figured I should hurry. I drove there pretty fast, and by the time I did get there, it was completely dark and storming. I entered the nature preserve, which was a single road that followed the cliff line on the coast for a couple minutes with nothing but trees on one side and beach on the other. No cars, no houses, no buildings, no people for what seems like forever. As I drove down the road a little ways, I began to feel uneasy. It all seemed a little creepy, and I felt really alone, but the moon was shining bright through the clouds and the beach was visible, so I figured I was all right. I found a great peak spot on the cliff overlooking the beach and decided to back my car up on it and rest. I opened up the back of my Jeep and climbed in and went to sleep. After a few hours, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had caused me to wake up, but there I was, awake. By this time, the storm had turned into a full-blown monsoon. I could barely see out my windows. The rain was so thick, but I could hear the waves of the ocean down below crashing against the beach, and the wind was blowing so loud that my car was shaking. I noticed water was pouring in through the cracks of my Jeep, and I tried to reach for my phone so I could turn the light on, but I realized I left it in the front, which was blocked by all my luggage, and the only way to get there was to open up the back and step outside. I was about to open the latch and let myself out, and that was when I heard it. Laughter. It sounded like a child at first, playing, but soon I realized it had to be someone older. They had to be close to the car, too, because it was raining so hard there's no way I could hear it if it was far away. I figured it might be a cop telling me to move, but then again, it had to be like 3 or 4 in the morning, and why would they be all the way out here in this weather anyway? I froze to listen, and then I could tell that it was getting closer. I obviously wanted to look up to see, but the way my Jeep was parked was backing up to the end of the cliff facing the beach, and my luggage was literally stuffed all the way through the rest of the vehicle, blocking all side and front windows. I was crammed in the way back, so at the time I was literally trapped and could only see out the back window. It was at that moment that I realized how helpless I was. Her voice grew louder and louder. I could tell now that it was in no way a cop. She was laughing hysterically, the top of her lungs, screaming, "Ah ha 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 ha!" By the steady increasing of volume, I could tell she was definitely coming up to my car, and then between laughs, I heard her creepy voice say, "Oh, well, what are you doing all the way out here?" My heart dropped. Her voice sounded exactly like Bellatrix Lestrange from Harry Potter, and I immediately thought to myself, "Oh my God, I am going to die." I sat there, frozen solid. I didn't want to move. I remember thinking to myself, this is not happening, this is not happening, this is not happening. But it was. With the storm raging outside my car, my phone being nowhere in reach, me being trapped in the back of the Jeep with no easy exit, on the edge of a cliff in the middle of nowhere, with maniacal, laughing women getting closer and closer, I was literally living in a full-blown horror film. The only thing I could do was wait. I sat there for a few more moments, and then that's when I saw her. I had poked my head up just a bit to see out the tiny space of visible window that looked to the side of my vehicle. About 10 feet or so from the Jeep, I could see through the thick rain and heavy fog a woman standing there facing not me, thank God, but the edge of the cliff toward the beach. Her arms were flaying up and down rapidly like a bird, and her head was twitching increasingly fast, all over in irregular patterns. Her clothes were ripped, and her voice was broken, and she literally looked like the zombies on The Walking Dead. I couldn't move. Literally all the fears built up in my head of what the source of this hysterical laughter may be came true in that second. I tried rationalizing the situation to myself like, she's on drugs, she's lost her mind, or this is someone joking, or literally anything. But every time I tried, I would peek back up and see that this is something unexplicable. It made no sense. How the hell would someone be out here in what I'm pretty sure was a Category 5 monsoon, 5 miles away from anything, no car, freezing temperature, standing up, screaming in the dead of night? I just couldn't believe it. She kept laughing hysterically, shaking her body all over as if she were fully possessed. I couldn't understand what words she was shouting in between laughs, but it sounded demonic. I was mortified. By the grace of God, I ended up finding a significantly large hunting knife stowed away in the bag next to me in the back of the Jeep, and after taking one last good look at this bewildered, wild devil witch woman, I decided it was time to say a prayer and try my best to sleep. I honestly don't know how I managed to do that, because if I remember right, she probably stayed there for another 30 minutes, howling at the moon. But somehow I did. And the next morning when I woke up, I slowly stepped out of my Jeep, knife in hand, of course, and I looked around. And there was nobody there. It was as if it had never happened. The sun was shining now, and the beach was calm. It was just me, and me alone. I was babysitting one night for a family friend about 4 years ago. I had put the kids to bed and crashed on the couch while waiting for my mom and the friend to get back from a night out. Randomly, I woke up and just remember being very confused about why I was even awake. That was, until I heard the front door close. A key thing to note here is the fact that the only sound was the door closing. There was no sound of it being locked, and this lock was very loud. I assumed it was my mom and her friend coming back, so I sat up, preparing to leave. However, I quickly noticed the lack of their voices. They are never quiet after a night out, especially because the friend always has some drinks. And I also noticed that there was only one set of footsteps. For a moment I considered the possibility of it being the friend's husband coming home to grab something. He is a firefighter and was at the station for one of his 24-hour shifts. I could hear the person walking around the front room and then going to the table in there and shuffling through papers as if frantically searching for something. The more I listened, though, the more it just didn't feel right. I pretty quickly dropped the idea of it being the husband and jumped to the idea that it was an intruder. Being around 15 at the time, I was in no way brave enough to confront any intruder that broke into the house. I barely managed to scoot along a wall leading to the front room before becoming completely paralyzed by fear. I ended up promising myself that I would keep my presence hidden until the person walked upstairs to the kids or back toward me. I could hear them pacing around a lot, papers and items being shuffled through. Eventually, I heard the footsteps start to come down the hall before turning into the bathroom, which was before they could reach me or the stairs. Only seconds after the footsteps walked into the bathroom, I heard the front door unlock. This ties back to the beginning because it really stuck out that the door was never locked, and I can remember every single sound from the second that I woke up. Immediately, I heard my mom and the friend talking loudly, and part of me was relieved, while the other part of me was prepared to hear them screaming upon finding an intruder in the bathroom that was too small to hide in. Shockingly, they just walked straight past it, and my mom told me to get my stuff so that we could go home. I was still listening the entire time, and the bathroom door never closed and no further footsteps were heard. As I finally walked down the hall to the door, I scanned the bathroom. The door was wide open, the window was shut and too small to fit anyone but kids through, and there was nobody crouched in the darkness. There was absolutely nothing off about the house. No windows open in any of the first floor, and nobody left between my mom coming back and us leaving. Nothing. I'm a skeptic. I like to think that this may have been an intruder, but I cannot think of any logical way that they could have hid in the short minute that it took for me to walk by, nor did they have an escape route. The friend never found an intruder or noticed any missing items. Nothing makes sense. All I know is that night is vividly ingrained in my mind, too vividly to be a dream, and I still get that feeling of something not being right when I think about it. I'm a die-hard agnostic skeptic with an open mind. I believe that anything is possible, but I want a logical and preferably scientific reason behind that anything. The last 10 days, however, have been absolutely insane. It started when I was a little kid. In my memories, I see kids between the ages of 5 and 11 with solid black eyes and smiles too big for their faces. I had a bad childhood, so I just figured they were added memories by an imaginative mind, because that's the answer that solidly fits my skeptical scientific worldview. Last month, I started seeing a girl. She told me about her experiences with sleep paralysis and shadow people. I explained to her that it was a rational experience caused by being in a hypnagogic state. Then she brought up the Cheshire Cat kids. Her recollections matched mine as a child. It was unnerving to say the least, and she and I spent almost an hour discussing the most minute details about them. Our stories matched. So, she does acid with her friends about 10 days ago, and told me that she stepped outside. A group of 6 of them were waiting for her. They showed her scenes from my life that were my darkest. She described them to me too accurately for her to have heard them from a second-hand source, which would be hard to do anyway, considering that I don't like sharing such detailed information. They then told her that I was going to die soon, and that she should stay away from me. This has put a monkey wrench into one of the most promising relationships of my 25 years. Since that night, I have nightmares of them coming into my room, licking my forehead, and showing me the memories of my past as if they were happening in that moment, complete with smells, sounds, sights, etc. I have written this part off as my subconscious mind reacting with my long-dormant PTSD, but they got more and more vivid. While this is happening, she has been distancing herself more and more. Last night was the weirdest part of the tale, however. I was driving down a windy country road to calm myself, and a pair of headlights flies from around a bend and runs me off the road, almost into a tree. When I looked, however, there was no car, and the headlights extinguished after passing me. I'm chalking all of this up to anxiety-started delusions and possible schizophrenia, but I cannot explain how she knew what she did, and why all of this is suddenly happening. I was home alone on Thanksgiving. It was 2015 around evening time, and I heard some knocking. Being in a festive and playful spirit, I opened the door without looking, and automatically felt a deep sense of regret, sort of like a literal, oh shit, moment. I didn't know where it was coming from until I actively started trying to place what was wrong with the situation, and that's when I realized they didn't have any whites in their eyes. For a second I thought, isn't Halloween over? And was confused until the oldest boy made eye contact with me. And that's literally when I felt like I was staring death in the face. They wanted to come in, and the way they spoke made it seem like they knew what I was thinking and were actively mocking my helplessness. I slammed the door on them, turned all my lights on, and started watching TV while they stood outside and would occasionally knock. I felt like I lost a good 6 hours of time because I don't even remember when I fell asleep or what I was last watching. I remember when I first sat down, Gabriel Iglesias was playing, but I don't remember anything. When I woke up, it was around 2 a.m., and the lights were all off, and there was only static on the TV. I have Dish Network, and there were no power outages in my area, and I don't get static if Dish were to go out. I would get a channel listed as an HDMI and a black screen, or it would be the introduction screen where it would show two people talking about the features of Dish Network. Also, if the lights went out, they would come back on. I had to literally switch the lights on and off a few times for it to work, but no one was home. After that, I would occasionally see them outside, and every time it would be pin drop silence, and my lights would occasionally go out or something would lose power like my dish. One time my phone that was at 63% dropped to 1% in 5 minutes. After a few months of being afraid of every knock, I decided to call an imam to bless the house. I also saged the house and brought a lot of different surahs, psalms, to put in every room, including the bathrooms. Since then, the visits have stopped. However, a few months after that, I remember hearing a blood-curdling scream and a banging sound on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing. A few months ago, maybe 2 or so, my mom and I heard a banging coming from the front door, and same thing. No one was there. I don't know if it was them, or something coming back, or just kids playing a prank, but I was so terrified. The area where I live is a heavily wooded Indian residential area, and we have no neighbors, and the closest town is about 15 minutes away. The only animals that come around are coyotes, black bears, sometimes wolves, and since I live in the southern part of Canada, there aren't any mountain lions that I've seen anyway. So a few nights ago around 2:50 a.m., I heard my dogs barking like crazy, and I got pretty annoyed by this because they never usually do it. It was hard for me to sleep, and I pulled out my phone to check the time, and like I said, it was almost 3. Since my bedroom has a window, I opened it to call my dogs back, and they didn't stop barking. I tried a few more times, but then I heard a sort of wailing, crying sound from the woods. I heard foxes can sometimes make screaming sounds, but this didn't sound like a fox's cry. I don't think it could have actually been a woman, considering, like I said, that we don't have neighbors. I tried telling my grandfather, but he doesn't hear it, and when I told my grandmother, she didn't want to talk about it since she can sometimes be superstitious. Last night, I woke up from a vision where my boyfriend bit me right between the shoulder blades. I turned to look at him, but he was deep asleep. The next morning, he told me that he saw a dream where I bit him between his shoulder blades. We were weirded out by this. There was no bite mark on his back, but it hurt like a bitch, by his words. The day starts going by and I notice him acting strangely. I've been working mostly with spirits before, and we live in a very old building with an interesting history, but this was new. He said he can't control his own body, that there is someone else with him. I started to get my stuff to banish whatever there was. I kept talking to him while gathering my things. He wasn't acting like himself anymore. He was very rude, but in a charming way while eating grapes on our bed. I banished the thing, still unsure of what it was. The rest of the day has been normal, and I haven't felt any bad energies, but my boyfriend keeps telling me that the bite between his shoulder blades keeps hurting. Does anyone have any idea what I am dealing with here? This happened 30 years ago when I was about 13, 14 years old, and me and an older friend were babysitting for a 6-year-old girl and her younger brother. We have been told that sometimes the girl complains about seeing a ghost man in her bedroom and upstairs at night, and that he comes out through the attic door. Now, I didn't believe a word of it. Kids are weird and say weird things. We get the kids ready for bed, but they wouldn't settle. The girl said that she felt scared, and her little brother started crying. She asked if she could sleep in her mom's bed until she got home. The little brother wanted to go with her. So I tucked them in and told some silly stories and laughed until they were both tired. Both kids were virtually asleep when we left, door ajar, hall light on. An hour later, we're sitting downstairs watching The Equalizer, and all was good. Kids were definitely asleep, as I had to sneak past their room to use the bathroom. I had a quick peek on my way back, and aside from the little brother snoring a bit, everything else was quiet. I go back downstairs, and we watch TV a bit more. About 20 minutes go by, and out of nowhere we hear banging. Heavy, heavy banging, and the kids are screaming immediately. I run up the stairs, and meet the kids as they're running out of the room. More banging, and this time I have eyes on the kids, so I know that they're not making the noise. The kids fly at me. I grab the little brother, and we rush downstairs into the front room, shut the door, and all crash onto the sofa. Everything is silent apart from the TV, which I switch off. We sit in silence for about 5 minutes, just sorta holding each other. After a bit, the girl, with tears in her eyes, just says in a matter-of-fact way, the man was angry because she wasn't in her own room, so he tried to push over a wardrobe, and then he started thumping the wall. This event has stayed with me all these years. This happened when I was young, around 7 to 8 years old. I was napping in my room that I shared with my younger brothers. Our bedroom consisted of only 3 mattresses put on top of 2-inch wooden panels and a child-sized wardrobe. There was also a floor-to-ceiling window that was strictly for decoration and couldn't be opened. When I woke up from my nap, my babysitter, she was a live-in, was folding our clothes. I talked to her for a while, and then went out to get a water. I don't remember what, but I needed to talk to her after, so I went in again. But she wasn't there. I remember thinking that it was weird. There had been no sound of any closing or opening of doors in the 5 minutes when I had left the room to go get the water. I proceeded to ask every person in the house if they had seen her. None of them did. So I went inside the room for a second time, thinking maybe she somehow was just hiding for some reason. But I still couldn't find her. I went out again and searched the house, before eventually going back to the bedroom for a 3rd time, and there she was, sitting in the bed, folding clothes like nothing had happened. I asked her where did she go. She replied, and I quote, "What are you talking about? I was here the whole time. I was shouting at you and asking you why you kept going in and out of the room, but you didn't answer me." She thought that I was pulling a prank on her, and I got reprimanded. There are still a couple of other incidents that happened around her, and to this day, I can't explain it at all. In high school, my friends and I were messing around with a Ouija board one night. We had done it before, and nothing remarkable had ever happened. We usually did it to try and scare each other or our girlfriends. We all thought it was a joke. That night, there was no one else home except the 7 of us, and we were all together around the board. One of the girls there wanted to try it. She had never done it before. This time was different. The board misspelled some of the words the same way every time. It gave answers that seemed historically accurate for our town, things we never knew or never cared about. Long story short, the spirit claimed it was a 10-year-old boy who had died on the property in the 1800s, and was buried there too in an unmarked grave. My friend's house was on a farm in the edge of town. We were all a little freaked out, because the board had never been so detailed and consistent. However, we were still skeptical, and we were all assuming one of us was trying to scare the rest. Finally, my friend asked if the spirit could do something to prove he was there with us. It went to yes, and then spelled out knock. Then the planchette stopped moving. We all just stared at it silently, and then there was a rap, rap, rap on the window right next to us. The lights were on outside, and there was absolutely no one there. We never touched that effing board again. I recently went bush camping with my boyfriend on Crown land near Stone Mills, Ontario. It was our first time doing bush camping, so I sent a video of our campsite setup to a friend. Days after this happened, I talked to my friend, who asked me about the ghost in the video that I was completely unaware of since I didn't take a second look at it after sending. When I had that closer look, I zoomed in to see a terrifying skeleton-like figure. At first, I thought it was a glare on the lens from the fire, but the figure is moving way quicker than the speed of the camera. This place was very deserted, but throughout the night, I heard clear footsteps that sounded human. So much so that I thought that the cops had come to kick us out when I saw a flashlight pointed us from the woods. I quickly pointed my light back, but never saw any animals or people. I have been camping a lot and have had deer, squirrels, and raccoons come to my campsite, and their footsteps did not sound like the ones that I had heard. I'm not a believer of the paranormal or anything of the sort, so I didn't even think about it until watching the actual footage. I spent the weekend camping throughout the Northeast, and all was very normal and quite nice. However, last night I camped in Massachusetts in a wooded area between Providence and Plymouth. Nothing felt negative, but I saw lights at least 3 times. The last time was just minutes ago, and that's what prompted me to write this. The lights are very quick, and almost out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what to say or quite how to describe it. I've never seen anything like it. And if it was paranormal, it was very clear. However, each time, they disappeared the second that I looked directly at them.